guys, in today's video I'm going to be looking at one of the case studies from Development Dynamics, which is Unit 1 in the GCSE for EdXLB, and we're going to be looking at Malawi as an example of a low income country and one that isn't very well developed. So I'm going to run through some physical and environmental factors and some economic and human factors why Malawi stays switched off, why Malawi can't develop. So we're going to start with 4 factors looking at the physical environment. And the first one is that we're going to consider is climate change. Now, climate change has got quite a big impact on lots of low-income countries because they're very much unable to respond to climate change. They can't adapt or mitigate, so it has a big impact on that. So in terms of Malawi, because of the position that it's in within Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, then what climate change is doing in Malawi is it's decreasing the amount of water available for the people and for crops, etc. It's decreasing, therefore, the amount of food that Malawi is able to grow and therefore give its own people or sell. And we've got an increase in temperatures, and with that, quite often, an increase in different types of disease, especially if it's combined with poor water quality. So that is some negative impacts of climate change. The next one I want to look at is the fact that Malawi is landlocked, which, as you know, means that it's away from the coast. It's very difficult for trade to get in and out of Malawi because it has to go through several countries, therefore maybe incurring costs, and it's not got a very good transport system as well, which is human actually, but landlocked is definitely physical because of where it's located. The next factor is that many people in Malawi suffer from what we call rural isolation, which means that many of its population are rural, not urban, and if you're rural then you are working in agriculture and therefore you're not able to sell any manufactured products, etc. So 85% of the population is located in rural areas. And then finally, Malawi suffers from lots and lots of pollution. To do with economic issues, obviously, and any manufacturing or any producing of minerals, etc. there, which is a human factor, but that feeds into the physical and the environmental areas of Malawi. And environmentally, it suffers from a lot of water pollution, a lot of air pollution, a lot of land pollution. So these factors kind of work together against Malawi and leave it unable to be able to develop. Now, tied in with this are some quite serious economic issues that Malawi faces. And the first one, as you'll be aware of, is something called terms of trade. And you really need to know what terms of trade means because this comes up at GCSE and actually in A-level, and this case study could be used for A-level as well. So Malawi has got very much negative, what we call negative terms of trade, which leads it to become indebted to maybe the World Bank or other loan agencies or other countries. And what that means is, if you remember terms of trade, it means that your imports are a lot higher than your exports. So Malawi is exporting lots, maybe not even a lot, raw materials, and we'll get to that in a minute. It's exporting commodities, and therefore they're very low value. It's not exporting manufactured goods to a certain extent, and it's not manufacturing processed goods to a certain extent neither. So when you manufacture or you process a good, you add value. So if it's not doing that with a lot of its production, then it will stay in poverty. And its exports are low, but its imports, it still needs to import things. It still needs to import food. It still needs to import machinery, maybe things for its healthcare, for its education, to build roads, etc., etc. So in order to be able to do that, it needs to take out loans, because the same way as if you had high expenditure but your income wasn't very high, then you'd have to lend money maybe off your parents or something like that, and you'd end up getting into debt if you didn't have a job that allowed you to pay that money back. So it's the same thing for Malawi, but just on a much bigger scale, is that its exports are very low and its imports are very, very high. So that means that it's got a deficit, okay? And so therefore it needs to borrow money to be able to buy the things that it needs to keep its people kind of educated or in healthy conditions, etc. So it's forced to borrow money, and this leads it to be in debt. So that's what terms of trade mean. Right, the next thing we're going to consider is global trade. Now, Malawi is a victim of global trade, or not being able to trade equally, really, and it's forced, really, because the World Trade Organization, although it wants taxes and tariffs to be banned or got rid of, places like the European Union or America, etc., ASEAN, etc., other big trading blocs, they don't allow really that much manufactured or processed goods to come into the country, because it puts them it puts their products at risk. So what it does is it adds a tax or a tariff, if you remember. So any goods coming in from Malawi, maybe if we consider some raw materials, the raw materials are able to be imported into the European Union, for example. But if Malawi decides to manufacture those goods or process those goods, then an import tax will be put on those goods to stop them competing with more expensive European goods, which is kind of good for us, but it's not very good for Malawi. So if the goods are manufactured or processed, then it leads to negative terms of trade, because their exports are very low and their imports are high. So these two things kind of match together. Also, we need to remember that tea and coffee, things like tea and coffee are commodities, and they're very low value, and their price fluctuates as well. So global trade isn't great for Malawi, and it leaves it in debt. And the final issue that we need to consider is the impacts of colonialism, which you remember is when the UK and other European countries went to other places around the world, and they essentially took the land from those nations and started producing goods, and they owned the goods. They give the country a little bit of money for the land, but essentially what's grown on the land belongs to that TNC, that transnational corporation, and that still exists today, what we call neo-colonialism. So the land belongs to the TNC, and any crops that are grown there belong to the TNC. The Malawians are maybe allowed to work on those farms, but very low wages. But the actual production and the products that are produced belong to the TNC, maybe belong to, I don't know, PG Tips or someone like that. And PG Tips own that land, they own the tea that's produced, so they keep the profits. So it doesn't profit Malawi for selling things like tea and coffee. And then that leads us to the idea of these commodities, or what we call cash crops. Now, cash crops very often will leave the country, and the money that is made from those cash crops will leave the country as well, because the TNCs own that land. So what we're saying here is that it's very hard to make money if you rely on raw materials, and it's also very hard if you trade in commodities, as tea and coffee is. Now, commodity means that the price of that good is decided even before those goods are grown. So the price can fluctuate around the world. So if the prices fluctuate, and this is quite important to remember, if the price of a product is fluctuating, then it's very hard for a country to plan economically if it doesn't know what price it's going to get for that commodity in the longer term. So if Malawi's not sure what kind of prices it's getting for its tea and coffee and its other raw materials, then it's very difficult for its government to plan where it's going to put those taxes and where it's going to put that money. So trading in commodities is quite a difficult thing for a country to cope with as well. So it won't be able to know what that tea or coffee is worth year on year. So the economic issues are all concerning trade, and the fact that Malawi trades in raw materials or commodities, and it doesn't really do an awful lot of manufacturing or processing to add value to those goods, so it stays economically poor. And tied to that are these physical and environmental issues, which lead the environment, etc., to be poor. Also, with these issues here, obviously, we can look at the fact that this physical environment, etc., will lead TNCs not to want to locate there anyway. So it kind of all ties in to lead Malawi to be a switched-off, low-income country. So this is one of your important case studies. If you're asked about a developing country, remember, not a developed country or an emerging country, Malawi is a low-income country. It's starting to develop, but it's not as developed as India. So we have to make sure that we use it as a low-income country, and it's a switched-off country as well.